Hello everyone, today we talk about medieval France and more in particular the 15th century nobiliar revolts against the crown, a topic that we already addressed in the videos about Charles VII and Louis XI, and that today we approach generally just to point the lights on the phenomenon as a whole. A phenomenon which is very complex because it touches on so many different aspects of, the entire realm and beyond to an extent, because these revolts, as you know, were also fueled by the enemies of the French crown outside the kingdom. Think about, just politics, of course, in general, but state building, like institutions. We made lots of videos, for example, about the establishment of a permanent core of companies, the Compagnie d'Ordonnance, as a matter of fact, that are, in fact, one of the most important medieval steps towards the establishment of so-called, modern professional standing armies. We've seen what resistance happened, in fact, from the nobility, even just rhetorically, to safeguard their military autonomy that, in fact, these rebellions consisted in, and that highlighted the need for a more concentrated power in the enormous French kingdom that was finally recovering from the difficulties, to say the least, of the 100 Years' War, and what had been triggered by the war also that as a social level, as we know, and that were, in fact, the most complete step towards the Renaissance state. You can argue that at the end of the Middle Ages, France had essentially the most solid, most concrete state. In Christian Europe, as a consequence, we're also looking at the strongest power within the same. The two things always go in parallel, regardless, of course, of the very feudal and oligarchic character that, in fact, France would maintain also at the cost of further, in fact, military development. I always point out how during the Italian wars, the lack of the fact of a real native French infantry, like a national infantry that could be compared to the one of the Swiss, the Landsknechten, and the Tercio. The former were used, as you know, by the French in lieu of a national infantry. I made an entire video on this topic. Really made the French lose in part. Like retrospectively, you can think it was at least a major systemic cause for the ultimate French defeat. Considering the enormous demographic and agricultural resources of France that could have provided with that arm, but also with lots of different problems at home, further revolutions from the side of, for example, pretty angry veteran commoners, against the nobility, and that fully explains in part why this was the case. In any case, back to the 15th century, of course, the topic extends to so many aspects of the history of the time, including the fact that France was stabilizing only at this point, was being brought together chunk by chunk, also successfully expanding in areas that had previously not been directly controlled by the French crown, regardless of the fact that they technically belonged, in fact, to the old kingdom's boundaries. So the 15th century in French politics is obviously marked by the ever-present threat of war to begin with, and much of this came from the external during the 100 Years' War, but in at the same time and after that as well, it kept coming from that, but also and especially from the internal rebellions. Influential magnates and royal kin, in fact, often gathered alliances of lesser nobles who were keen to secure patronage and protection. This phenomenon is very important because not just we've seen in many videos the relevance of the lesser nobility as the de facto numerical backbone, numerical and qualitative backbone, really, of the French military as a whole, up to the French Revolution, as a matter of fact, regardless of all the competition with the bourgeoisie, etc. In in a process that in the last couple of centuries of the Middle Ages had witnessed. It had started from quite a while, but in France had taken like very important elite, taken on very important elite and hierarchical characters, had this distance ever more this competent, right, knights from the vertex of power, given that France had an enormous social stratification, so even knighthood really entailed, and nobility for how it was also diversifying at this point, entailed all a series of echelons that, in a sense, were rendering the individuals at the bottom of the chain ever more dependent, in fact, on the great princes at the top. All right, so that when we look at Burgundy, at Brittany, etc., we're fundamentally looking at, as you know, to a different degree, to a sort of an alter monarchy, or at least something that was trying to princely rule, as many other states in Europe has bit something on its own. Naturally, France was already quite intertwined in ways that rendered, in fact, also these rebellions not a war against the monarchy per se, right? Nobody really was rebelling to tear down the monarchy as a system, but if anything, to undermine the current house, the current branch, because at the end of the day, also these were a large part of the same Valois, and so Capetian family, but to rise to power as well. And this was the problem with the nobility, especially in a country like France. It was so intensely feudal and oligarchic from quite a while. There are all some considerations on also the luck that the French crown had as any power that succeeds in such great feats. But we should stress especially the political competence and the pre-res statal culture that allowed for the reinforcement, re-establishment of the French monarchy and its further expansion and consolidation. Those who defied the crown's authority in 1439, 1465, and 1488, because this is the list of wars that we will analyze better in detail now, generally masked their rebellions with demands for some kind of reform, right? Which already highlights the fact that they weren't really trying to tear the system down, but to essentially orient it towards a more favorable condition towards the nobility. We have seen really lots of different states, and we've made lots of, for example, historical regional episodes about, especially the 14th century and the later Middle Ages in general, to show how, for example, in Central Europe, the nobility won against the monarchy. They succeeded in making these realms explode into some elective states that basically had an important control on the monarchy rather than the other way around. Western Europe follows another path, right? The English, regardless of their defeat during the 100 Years' War, would as well accomplish the Wars of the Roses that decimated the House of the Lords for the Tudors to enjoy quite some concentrated power. This is the same basically for the Iberian monarchies, also for the Italian states. There is a tendency towards properly the affirmation of a central state, and escaping a bit with reforming up, leveling up, so to say, that feudal institution, even in its later medieval form compared to the previous one. It was much more private and sort of fragmented in ways that channeled the establishment towards like a shared consensus towards the necessity of maintaining the central institutions, of course, with the participation in the same. Recently, I also made a video about, for example, the Venetian reforms of the mid-14th century that highlight a very tight lock that, as you know, would maintain the Venetian Senate untouched as an institutional mechanism till the end of the Serenissima. So here, more or less, different countries have different history. But in Western Europe especially, this is what it's practically happening. The actions of the rebels in France So we've seen very high-profile, princely, actually royal rebels themselves. Again, look at the Burgundians. You realize that they were basically the same royal dynasty, just a different branch. Their actions were fueled, in the sense, by a princely personal ambition, rather than by any, at least clear, ideological plan. Right? They themselves wouldn't or couldn't undermine the sense of the monarchy. Think about the 100 Years' War, and not just the fact that the English and the Burgundians had ruled from Paris at a point, but that this was essentially a dynastic struggle, so that there is actually a sense of political and territorial reality where, of course, the English would have, say, benefited from the fragmentation of France historically, even when ideally succeeding in installing their own monarchy also in Paris. But when it comes to, in fact, the Burgundians, for example, even though they definitely sabotaged the French effort to an important degree, they were doing it instrumentally for gaining power in their own regard across, say, in fact, the boundary between France and the Holy Roman Empire. And they were basically an expression of the same culture. Made lots of videos about also the Burgundian states, and we will surely come back on them because they're, as you know, a bit the protagonists of these rebellions, but not the only ones. So rather than seeking to overthrow the monarchy, these insurgents aimed to gain influence over it, right? So at times operating from the distance when, say, the monarchy, the crown still maintained some important also capacity on its own, demanding roles, for example, in royal governance and access to the crown's wealth, which in different ways had also it pushed towards different directions, right? Through this cooptation, you could get, of course, also to consolidate the system. We've seen it especially for medieval Castile. That was also a very feudal country. But at the same time, if public culture deteriorated too much, like getting your hands into the royal coffers was not probably the best way if you were based outside, let's say, of the crown's regional scope to help the latter. And this is in fact what at the end of the day failed as a dynamic. The crown was stronger than these single principalities for reasons that are a bit obvious, because the French monarchy was not born the day before, regardless of all the late medieval crisis. They definitely had maintained the sense that, and in a sense also thanks to the methods of steel, something similar had happened during the Viking era, paradoxically, that the war itself contributed to foster, we were just talking about this yesterday, a sense of French national identity that could go beyond, in fact, a mere sort of historical, ethnic regional background in northern France, etc. And it's still, again, a heavily feudal country. It will maintain many of those characteristics even up to the France of Louis XIV and beyond. But it was now a much more updating one, at least, that was recognized as, at the end of the day, a positive also for some of the same princes involved here, regardless of the fact that they tried till the end to maintain their own position. And because, as you know, they had gained really pretty big power. They weren't simple vassals of the crown. They really had established, especially in the case of Burgundy, some sort of veritable states within the system. When you look at the rest of France, however, there wasn't much else, right? Aside from the English-controlled areas and Brittany, that was rather peripheral. More or less, what we intend as France had become so in a vast expanse sense across northern and central France already from the time of Louis IX, like the 13th century. I also made videos specifically on this affirmation of not just of the French market, but that was the paramount example. And that's also a dynamic that, as you know, starts from the 12th, etc. It's interesting to see, of course, how this mechanism was in many ways defined by the repeated struggles against the English in different times during the Middle Ages. In any case, this was sort of the apparently most definitive, right? So let's briefly present the three main wars we're discussing here, the main rebellions. Then we will understand something a bit more in depth about them. This video is not dedicated specifically to that. We will make in-depth videos for each of these topics in general. Today we just present them in a comprehensive fashion. So the first one is the Praguerie, so the Praguerie, named to evoke the Hussite revolt, so basically the mess that had happened in Prague. It was actually also pretty contemporary if you look at the years. I made some videos about the Hussites a couple of months ago. Arose when nobles moved to check the power of Charles VII, who had, as you know, grown confident, especially following the Treaty of Arras and his recent recovery of Paris. Right, this is the coming back, the time of La Pucelle, after the siege of Orléans and the very sort of powerful French coming back. During the Estates General of 1439, Charles endangered the autonomy of the princes by banning private armies, which had been, formally tolerated in the sense that they could have not been, in fact, disbanded anyway. But let's say in this moment of coming back of the same French monarchy, there was no need to for vassals out there to simply defend themselves on their own. These were some of the same vassals that had literally marched on Paris with the English. So this was evidently felt like a pretty, important affront to the nobiliary prerogatives that should be understood also in a very ideological and cultural sense, right? The French nobility was the greatest nobility of all nobilities, right? They were incredibly loaded, arrogant, just by default habituated to compete, right, and to show off and to fight and to, be quarrelsome, so to say. So at this point, the Duke of Bourbon, that, as you know, was I also made a video about the Bourbon dynasty rather than Bourbon in particular, but that had in fact gained an enormous power in central France during the Italian wars. They would also essentially rebel like a state within the state, siding with the Habsburgs. Along with others, convinced the young Dauphin, Louis, that would become Louis XI, and we talk about this in the video about the latter that I made specifically, to join their outright rebellion. Clashes in Poitou, Auvergne, and the Bourbonnais itself, as we will see, reestablished royal control by June 1440, but peace came at the cost of delaying military reforms and granting pensions and positions on the royal council to many of the rebels, so buying them out practically. Today we will not much look at the parallel development of the French monarchy. That would be actually the most important aspect, let's say, at least from an administrative point of view. I explained some of this again in other videos, but it would explain better, if anything, how and why, they rose at the center. There was a great deal of, taxation connected with the establishment of an army. That's something in which I would say we should notice, because many people today think for some reason, for being a powerful country, you shouldn't have an army. You just be full of money and disarmed. Guess what happens when that is established instead? But this is just a joke. But as you know, I presented it as a joke, but it's not a joke at all. Right? This is literally what eventually happens. In any case, in 1465, you have again a new nobiliar league, the so-called one of the public good. Right, a misleadingly named effort to actually limit a king whose aspirations outstripped his means. While nominally under the leadership of Louis XI's brother, Charles of France, the League was in fact primarily driven by the Dukes of Bourbon and Brittany, that, as you understand, played with the current, king's brother, so within the crown's current house. And trying to gain legitimacy from these figures. We had the same Charles the Bold of Burgundy, then Count of Charolais, that wasn't, in fact, head of the states of Burgundy as a whole yet. Louis XI's forces reasserted his control in the Bourbonnais and managed to retain Paris following the unresolved Battle of Montlhéry that we were mentioning also the other day, as far as the alleged presence of some cavalry charge from the Burgundian side over their own archers, July 16, 1465. Nevertheless, Louis was compelled to negotiate, and through the treaties of Conflans and Saint-Maur, he agreed to reinstate the pensions and offices of many he had rashly stripped of power upon taking the throne. Louis XI was an excellent king, regardless of the dark, the Black Legion was sown on him during the modern novels, and one that would in fact tend to insult the nobility by, for example, dressing up like a merchant, so siding with the Third Estate, and so all elements were trying to administratively tie with the crown and counter, in fact, this nobiliar princely autonomy and abuse of power. The king ended up granting his rebellious brother, now tamed, but still in exchange of this, in fact, the appanage of Normandy. Also, a video about medieval Normandy that discusses this, and make peace with the dukes of Brittany and Burgundy as well. As late as 1488, a comparable uprising dubbed the Guerre Folle broke out when the dukes of Brittany and Orléans contested the regency of Anne of Beaujeu. However, the subsequent incorporation of Brittany into the royal domain signaled the end of armed challenges to royal authority that now was becoming really very consistent. The French were also expanding in other territories, especially in the northeast. D'Artois, the other territories that had basically no chance to simply stand their ground alone, especially after the demise of the Burgundian states. In any case, Brittany was the last major independent principality in France. It would technically not be even properly subsumed by the French crown until the 16th century. However, from that point forward, rebels like the Duke of Bourbon in 1525 were no longer seen as defiant vassals, but as traitors who merited exile or execution rather than reconciliation, simply because the French crown had truly enough power on its own to put them successfully down. Passing to some greater detail about the three wars, we have to also contextualize them a bit better in the timeline of French history. The Praguerie 1440 was a fleeting yet significant rebellion in the country erupting during the very tumult of the 100 Years' War, as King Charles VII grappled still with a fractured realm. The video made on him really explained why this was the king under whom France as a whole came back under properly a comprehensive control, right? And so under Louis the 11th would be, if anything, the re-expansion. It was actually a fairly rapid process as well, witnessing to the solidity of the French state, even after the greatest crisis, right? The peak of danger and existential threat. King Charles VII, at this point, sought to further tighten royal control. As things had gone fundamentally better politically, the Praguerie stemmed from this deep-seated tensions between the crown, again, and power from French nobility, whose feudal privileges were threatened by Charles' centralizing reforms. The king, bolstered by his coronation in 1429 with Joan of Arc's aid, had embarked on an ambitious program to strengthen the monarchy. His creation of a standing army, the Compagnie d'Ordonnance, and imposition of heavier taxes provoked resentment among nobles accustomed to autonomy and private armies. It's not much just that their armies were to be disbanded, which was, of course, a big deal, but in practice, the king could at this point already establish his own companies that were to be paid also by the nobility, but were already there. We've seen how they had come into existence. These were basically the most loyal companies that, instead of being disbanded at the end of the campaign, were to be remain billeted and partially salaried in the sort of most strategic French towns controlled by the monarchy. I also made a video about 15th century European men-at-arms passage, say from half to full salary, essentially would had to cover all the military expenses of these professional soldiers. Otherwise, they would have gotten it from other means, given that they were at large, as we've seen, lesser noblemen themselves, and so they had means, but required further funding in order not to lose from this craft. The court itself was a cauldron of factionalism divided between loyalist Armagnacs and those with lingering Burgundian sympathies, further complicating loyalties. Leading the rebellion were Charles I, as we've seen, Duke of Bourbon, and John II, the Duke of Alençon, both chafing at royal encroachments and the growing influence of Charles VII's advisors, such as Pierre de Brezé and Georges de la Tremoille, that we discussed also, in fact, in the video about the court of Charles VII. That was carrying out also a vast campaign of political propaganda through the exaltation of the monarchic ideology, in the arts, in the manuscripts, illuminations, probably in the ways the individuals at court were represented in connection with the crown and divinity as well. Now, to lend their cause legitimacy, the rebels enlisted the 16-year-old Dauphin Louis, the future Louis XI, though his role was largely symbolic, we should say. At some point, the guy was invited over by the Burgundians. He was truly the only Dauphin, in the sense of a prince who ruled in the Dauphiné, where he also distinguished himself. He fought also in Switzerland. He was pretty active and energetic, as a matter of fact. So this is the universal spider of the later age, right? But everything was calibrated from a school, a very hard and excellent school of the young Dauphin that had mostly, it was actually more ambitious than his father, so more, incisive. And he had just been manipulated, or basically he let himself be manipulated also to receive money in the process, because his father was not supporting it enough. To cloak, in fact, the rebels' ambitions in the guise of, again, reform, something that would have, again, to entail still an order of the kingdom, but, say, more in favor of the nobility. Named after the Prague revolt of 1419, the Praguerie reflected the nobles' desire to curb royal power and restore their traditional dominance, or better, the one that they had managed to win during the 100 Years' War in part, framing their uprising as a defense against corrupt governance. Strategically, the Praguerie was a less coordinated war than a series of localized power plays. In early 1440, the coalition of disgruntled nobles centered in regions like Bourbonnais, Auvergne, and Poitou mobilized their feudal levies and seized key strongholds, aiming to pressure the king without risking open battle. If you look at the map of France, you understand that still this area is sort of a crescent that starts from, say, the Massif Central up to basically Brittany, the Loire mouth. So this was still basically winking at the English in the process and trying essentially to counter the French monarchy from its national, properly French basis in the north. We have observed how these patterns will repeat themselves throughout other times of French history for essentially national reasons. The Occitanians liking the French, a few really, even though here the nobility was fully French and just exploiting this discontent, like to weaponize it against the monarchy. So think about this also in, say, of course they thought they could sort of manage this. It's not like they were thinking to be destroying France in the moment. But at the same time, it's still a concept you can understand only when you are so sure of your own individual prerogatives and how much you can surpass your limits in what objectively does endanger at least the current situation of the crown. When you put enough pressure, then you negotiate and you obtain hopefully what you want. But it's also a war, and it's extremely costly. So it's always actually a big gamble. The nobleman's strategy relied on exploiting regional influence and fortifying castle to challenge royal authority. So the usual thing, there is a region that rises up and you seize its major fortresses in one shot to eventually entrench there, even though it's not too easy just to keep maintaining those garrisons that cost as well. And again, the crown already has a better army than the one these vassals have, and even though it's practically like of the same mold. Charles VII, leveraging his newly reformed military, responded with decisive force that was a test for the same. His Compagnie d'Ordonnance, the professional and mobile army, outmatched the rebels' scattered forces. This aspect strategically is crucial, really. It reflected the preeminence of the crown from like probably an hegemonic standpoint in the realm, so that regardless of the fact that, of course, the rebels were attacking from different directions and across different lands, it was somehow easy for a more concentrated force of that might to basically take them out in detail. So you see how things can be methodically addressed and disposed of. Rather than a single climatic engagement, the rebellion unfolded through swift royal campaigns to recapture rebel-held towns and fortresses. Lots of siege warfare, as you can imagine. By mid-1440, Charles' army had quelled the uprising, isolating the rebels and forcing their submission. The Praguerie's collapse revealed the growing strength of the monarchy and the futility of feudal resistance against a centralizing state. Politically, it exposed the fragility of noble unity, as the rebels' self-interest undermined their cause, while strategically it underscored the effectiveness of Charles VII's military reforms, cementing his authority and foreshadowing the eventual consolidation of royal power in France. The War of the League of the Public Weal, erupting in 1465, was the aforementioned formidable noble revolt against King Louis XI of France. A cunning and centralizing monarch, as we've seen, whose policies inflamed the feudal aristocracy a bit too much politically. The rebellion was rooted in the deep resentment of France's powerful nobles who chafed under Louis's relentless efforts to consolidate royal authority at the expense of their traditional privileges. Having ascended the throne in 1461, Louis IX pursued an aggressive agenda to weaken the nobility, dismantle their private armies, and impose heavier taxation to fund his administration. His reforms, including the expansion of royal bureaucracy and interference in noble jurisdictions, alienated key figures like Charles, the Duke of Berry, that was, as we've seen, Louis' younger brother, Jean II, the Duke of Bourbon, and Charles the Count of Charolais, later Charles the Bold of Burgundy, who saw their influence eroded. The rebels formed the League of the Public Weal ostensibly to champion the public good. That this symbolized by curbing Louis' autocratic rule and restoring feudal liberties. The coalition cleverly cloaked their self-interest in reformist rhetoric, rallying around the young Duke of Berry, whom they propped up as a pliable figurehead to challenge the St. Louis legitimacy. Beneath these facades, the League was a fractious alliance, once again driven by personal grievances and regional ambitions, with especially Burgundy's powerful Charles seeking to expand his own dominion. This is also a bit like the picture. There wasn't any major power around anymore. The English at some point threatened to invade France once again in big style in conjunction with the Burgundians. I made some videos about this, how it also intertwined with Italian politics at the same time. But regardless, of course, of the pernicious presence of a French opposition within probably the bulk of the Kingdom of France, Burgundy was, as we've seen, a state, regardless of its actual frailty that gets a bit too often forgotten, that could equate to some kind of, at least, bulwark on its own, some kind of country, if you want, even though it wasn't, say, a country as we intended, but let's say a state, right, a political, territorial domination that at that point could not really threaten, again, especially the bulk of the revived French monarchy, but could sort of hold out against it and possibly carving out something for themselves, without mentioning that the Valois-Burgundy connection with the French crown could even open different scenarios in terms of inheritance, etc. Louis' early betrayals, such as reneging promises to cede territories to nobles and his diplomatic intrigues, which sowed distrust, even though they've been a bit too overstated in that, or he was just making normal policy to, of course, curb the nobiliary influence, but in fact it's mostly like something to celebrate than anything, further fueled, of course, the rebellion, making it equally a direct challenge to Louis' vision of a unified crown-dominated France. Strategically, the War of the League of the Public Weal was a more coordinated and widespread one than the earlier Praguerie, as we've just seen, though still marked by noble disunity, which at the end of the day is the worst you can have politically when waging a war. In spring 1465, the League mobilized formidable armies, as a matter of fact, drawing on the feudal levies and mercenaries of its members. This was the normal composition of the armies of the time, as we've seen, particularly Burgundy's well-equipped forces that, as we've seen, had the lion's share military-wise due to the quite advanced military of that state that we also discussed in multiple videos. The rebels aimed to encircle Paris and forced Louis XI to capitulate even, launching a multi-pronged campaign across central and northern France that were the bulk of the same crown's power. Key strongholds in regions like Bourbonnais, Brittany, and Normandy became focal points as the League sought to disrupt royal control and assert regional dominance. Louis, a master of political and military maneuvering, responded with characteristic agility. He leveraged his loyal standing army, bolstered by taxes and reforms, and employed diplomacy to fracture the League's unity, exploiting rivalries among its leaders. The war's pivotal moment came at the Battle of Montlhéry, that we mentioned before, in July 1465, a chaotic and inconclusive clash south of Paris, where Louis' forces narrowly avoided defeat against Charles of Charolais' Burgundian army. Though tactically indecisive, Montlhéry allowed Louis to regroup and maintain pressure on the rebels. Right? Rather than risk prolonged warfare, Louis opted for negotiation at that point, having essentially outmaneuvered the League, both strategically and diplomatically. He sent his troops in he stopped the threat and at that point gained enough time to gain the upper hand. This is, master politics in a strategy. It shows how malleable and chameleon-like, just to aside from Clausewitz's, war really is. The treaties of Conflans and Saint-Maur in October 1465 ended the war, granting concessions like territories and privileges to the nobles, including ceding Normandy to the Duke of Berry, his brother. However, Louis's concessions were also strategic, as he later undermined these agreements himself, reasserting control through guile and force at the same time. Again, the nobility resources weren't infinite. They had lots of things to think about by themselves. And especially the divide between Burgundy and the rest of France was mostly the most important aspect of the war. The war exposed the nobility's inability to sustain a unified front, once again, which also in moral terms tilts towards some general, this is not a good idea to begin with. While Louis's survival and subsequent consolidation of power underscored the monarchy's growing dominance, the League's failure marked a critical step towards absolutism, the so-called absolutism, of course, as Louis XI's deft handling of the crisis weakened feudal resistance and paved the way for a stronger, centralized France. Finally, the Guerre Folle, that is to say the Mad War, the Foolish War, of 1485-1488, was sort of a much more chaotic and fragmented rebellion against the French crown, showing how sort of desperate the situation also for anyone hoping to resist to it really was at that point. We should point out that, of course, France historically had, differently from England, for example, a set of political, juridical, and ideological tradition that favored, at a national level, the affirmation of a centralized government. The war, as usual, was driven by noble discontent and regional ambitions during the early reign of Charles VIII at this point. Politically, it emerged from the simmering tensions between France's feudal aristocracy and the centralizing policies of the Valois monarchy, intensified by the power vacuum following Louis XI's death in 1483. Louis's relentless consolidation of royal authority, as we've seen, had already alienated many noblemen, and his successors, Charles VIII, a 13-year-old king, and his regent sister, Anne de Beaujeu, faced the challenge of maintaining his reforms amidst a restive nobility. The rebels, led by Louis II, Duke of Orléans, the future Louis XII, and supported by Francis II, Duke of Brittany, sought to curb the crown's growing dominance and preserve their feudal privileges. Orléans, ambitious and resentful of Anne's regency, aimed to seize influence over the young king, while Brittany's involvement was driven by its fierce desire to maintain autonomy against French encroachment. Of course, every time regency, especially exercised by a woman, was involved, because the minority of a king, like in this case, the various noblemen of France, including the ones that would succeed to the throne eventually, like Louis, would feel like to the necessity to make a stand, to say the least. The League of the Public Weal's earlier failure, as we've seen in 1465, echoed in the Guerre Folle, as nobles like the Duke of Alençon and other lesser lords joined, hoping to reverse Louis XI's centralizing legacy. The rebellion's name, again, Mad War, reflected its disorganized and reckless nature, mostly fueled by personal rivalries and lacking actually a unified political and strategic vision beyond opposition to the crown, and just for a reason that was essentially dynastic at this point. Because of the minority of the king, foreign powers, notably England and the Holy Roman Empire, lent tacit support, by the way, exploiting France's internal divisions to weaken its position in European politics, right? It was clear to everybody that France was rising as the strongest power in the West, and say trying to to bog it down a little bit by exploiting turmoil from the within at every useful chance was a very important picture, right? The Germans did not want the French to enter Italy. The Italians, of course, didn't want that either. The English were hoping that at least a weak France would allow for some kind of other room for maneuvering in northwestern Europe. Spain was also watching, and so this is mostly also a prefiguration of the same Italian wars that the same Charles VIII will launch himself, also for reasons that, as you know, were connected to traditional ideas of crusade, right? As using Naples in particular as a launch pad towards Jerusalem, but mostly to reclaim the Angevin legacy in southern Italy that now was controlled by the Aragonese. Strategically, the Guerre Folle was a disjointed war, right, marked by sporadic campaigns and limited coordination among the rebels. Beginning in 1485, the coalition mobilized the usual regional forces, with Brittany serving as a key stronghold due to its strategic position and defiance of French authority. The rebels aimed to destabilize the regency by seizing key fortresses and rallying support in regions like the Orléanais. That was, by the way, a very important symbol of properly a legitimate Frenchness, given that, as you know, this was the place where basically the monarchy was reduced to in that critical 1429, and with an excellent position on the Loire, and as a sort of joint between, a sort of hinge between northern and central France, right? So the rebels sought to challenge Anne de Beaujeu's control through political intrigue and military pressure. However, the League lacked the cohesion of earlier rebellions, that, as we've seen, had not been the best either from that point of view, as personal agendas fractured their efforts further. This wasn't really much the time anymore of sort of trying to prevent the crown from taking over. Like, Burgundy was gone. The whole matter was mostly this, internal situation connected with the king's minority. Anne, in her own regard, a shrewd and resolute regent, countered with a combination of military force and diplomatic finesse. Backed by loyal royal armies, strengthened by Louis XI's standing Compagnie d'Ordonnance that had remained faithful to the crown, she launched campaigns to suppress rebel strongholds. The war's turning point thus came in 1488 with the Battle of Saint-Auban-du-Cormier, where royal forces decisively defeated the Breton and rebel armies, capturing Orléans, quite the golden apple of the situation, and thus de facto crippling the rebellion for good. Brittany's resistance collapsed, in fact, soon after, with the death of Francis II and the subsequent Treaty of Verget in 1488, which forced Brittany's heiress, Anne of Brittany, yet another Anne, and quite important, heiress, right, to, in fact, the ducal, to the Brittonic duchy, to marry Charles VIII, effectively annexing the duchy to France, even though she was actually maintaining the duchy as a separate possession of hers, and that's why this technically did not mark actually the subsumption of Brittany to the French crown's estates. The Mad War's failure highlighted the rebels' inability to overcome internal divisions and the crown's superior military and political organization. Politically, it solidified the Valois monarchy's dominance as Anne de Beaujeu's regency successfully navigated the crisis, preserving Louis XI's centralizing gains. Strategically, the absorption of Brittany marked a significant step toward French territorial unity, reducing feudal autonomy in strengthening the crown's authority in the face of noble and foreign opposition alike. These are more or less the events. Concluding the video with some more systemic remarks, we can evaluate the role of magnates and the royal kin, for example. So nobles like the Dukes of Bourbon, Burgundy, and Brittany controlled vast estates and consequently military resources as well, making them formidable rivals to the crown. Right, the crown couldn't simply step into those lands unless something clamorous happened, like literally the Burgundians suiciding themselves against the Swiss, the Dukes of Bourbon being sort of more malleable and tameable, and Brittany at the end of the day being absorbed to inheritance, to marriages, right? So these guys' wealth and power, because, for example, Louis XI wouldn't even simply go at war against Burgundy. He did so only when Charles the Bold died and Mary, his daughter, had remained practically without protection, so that she married Maximilian I. And so technically Louis XI could have chosen to try to hope that, again, for Burgundy to fall into France, just like Brittany would, through marriage strategies, etc. But at that point, he correctly evaluated that Burgundy was weak enough to be invaded in one shot, and so it was taken over. And the Netherlands basically passed to the Habsburgs through the Habsburgic marriage, but also lost some pieces. And hadn't it been really for Guinegate, it's possible that France, in fact, would have controlled much more land up there. In any case, comprehensively, like these magnates, wealth and patronage networks attracted lesser nobles. We've seen it, we relied on them for protection and advancement in a feudal system where loyalty was transactional, right? So there were lots of Frenchmen involved in, of course, both sides, regardless of also the general, like France and the outer world that tried to mostly soften up the former, so to say, this proportional power. Figures like the Dauphin Louis during the Praguerie, Charles, Duke of Berry during the War of the League, and Louis, Duke of Orléans during the Mad War, are all important characters leveraging their proximity to the throne to claim legitimacy. All right, they're very close to the monarchy, and this tells you how, in a sense, this wasn't much of a... the French situation wasn't particularly different from the one of other feudal monarchies, if not for the fact, I mean, think about what happened in the Wars of the Roses, what was happening in Castile, etc. At the end of the day, there is a process of recomposition that also passes through the fact that the protagonists of these revolts were the same, say, royal kin, and so more or less they shared the necessity of maintaining to claim power, rather than, even when supporting the rebels, wanting to undermine the crown per se, right? In fact, these rebellions, as we understood, were less about overthrowing the monarchy and more about securing a dominant role within it, right? Especially the more time went on, whether through regencies, fiefs, or advisory position. Finally, there are some patronage and alliances, connections that are interesting. For example, lesser nobles, as we see, joined these rebellions to gain patronage, land, or royal favor. In the League of the Public Weal, Charles the Bold's coalition included minor lords from Artois and Picardy that were the territories that basically the French were to take over under Louis XI and beyond. So they had an extra reason to fight against that centralizing process. But were also drawn at the same time by promises of wealth and status, because it's not just like they were for some reason against the French crown just per se. They had to be convinced to fight also by another contendant. These frontier areas had more than a reason to do so. This system of alliances amplified the threat of rebellion, but also made coalitions fragile, as Louis the 11th divide and conquer tactics demonstrated. Besides, again, the crown really controlled a bulkier territory dominion. Probably they had more political control over more resources, and they knew how to use it. This is not to determine by itself the outcome of these rebellions, but there was a much greater centrality of the crown that favored, as we were saying before, also through mentality, the adherence to the monarch. As we said before, there were important administrative calls to reform that are actually masking personal ambition to a great degree. In each rebellion, demands for reform centered on reducing taxes, restoring noble privileges, or curbing royal advisors. They were quite intrusive, to say the least. The Praguerie targeted Charles VII's fiscal policies. For example, the League invoked the public weal, and the Mad War sought noble inclusion in governance. And you see how this all basically digresses gradually towards something that doesn't even care about countering the emergence of a state. At the beginning, you hit at the core of it, fiscal policy. You don't want really just to give any resource to the crown. Then there is some sort of negotiation phase where you call to some public good of sort, and then you just want basically a place during the Mad War in the government rather than else. These demands naturally resonated with broader discontent, particularly among nobles and towns burdened by war taxes as well. They weren't the same. It's not like just the nobility was univocally against the crown, obviously enough, nor just towns that had been very, very important in royal policy, because they were the same ones protected by the same Compagnie d'Ordonnance billeted there, would simply support that same, because they were also to contribute for the maintenance of the latter. So it's all very, very mixed. Evidence suggests ambition drove these uprisings as well. I mean, the Duke of Bourbon's role in the Praguerie, for example, aimed to reclaim influence. Charles the Bold's territorial gains in 1465 prioritized the Burgundian power. And Orleans' actions in 1488 were a blatant power grab. The rebels rarely proposed systemic alternatives to monarchy. There wasn't any, and especially among noblemen who were so radically elite, to not to see that they were royalty themselves, basically. Instead, seeking roles in royal councils or control over crown resources that were sort of publicly undermining, but also allowing for some possible regime changes, a dynastic switch, or at similia, or at least control, as it had happened in the previous years. Think about the madness of Philip VI, that also had a pretty long reign at the end of the day. Managed to that would allow, had presented with a precedent, right? That's why Charles VII rise to power is so important, because he was at that point like finally the real king, not simply the dauphin, and taking matters in his own hands, and just also with a bit of a support from the Holy Ghost in Joan of Arc. Unlike later revolutions, for example, the 1781 one, these rebellions did not challenge the monarchy's legitimacy. Nobody was really thinking to say, okay, France should not be a monarchy, it should be something else. That didn't make any sense whatsoever. Nobody thought about that. Rebels operated within the feudal framework, which was, again, private enough to leave out some ambiguity, but it was just like some sort of power-sharing, hierarchical struggle to the top, right? Seeking to manipulate or dominate the crown. For instance, the League's proposal for a princely regency aimed to control Louis XI, not depose him. While personal ambition was dominant, some ideological elements existed as well. Like, all these protagonists had sort of different idea of the monarchy, including the same kings, as a matter of fact. Different generations, different sort of situations in general, also internationally, different opportunities. The call for Estates General involvement in the League of the Public Weal, for example, echoed proto-constitutional ideas that in France were sort of as we've seen, less preponderant, as the parliament was, generally speaking, more subjected to the monarchy. But still, there was, of course, an estate representation that was meant to cooperate in that sense, or better, like the king was meant to cooperate with. More than else, however, was the more general, in fact, also transnational resistance to taxation that reflected the most genuine grievances, regardless also of just the mere economic value. Because it was about, like, what kind of country do we want? Like, the Compagnie d'Ordonnance costs a lot. Why should we pay for them? Why should we not organize ourselves as freemen, ideally, just like the noblemen that mostly controlled everything, with our own private forces? So this was a very slippery slope, so to say, and the matter had to be actually proven on the battlefield why the Compagnie d'Ordonnance were a better idea, like when they actually crushed those nobiliar forces, proving their worth. However, this is secondary in general to the magnates' self-interest, as their quick acceptance of territorial financial concessions, such as the treaty at Conflans, reveals. There is also, in fact, the same Crown's perspective, like how much wealth would they get? Not too much. Like, of course, they were trying actually to make the French kingdom reemerge in a statal fashion, so that the Crown had to dispose of some wealth from its public prerogatives. So each rebellion, though initially disruptive, ultimately bolstered the Crown, if you look at it. Charles VII's suppression of the Praguerie, for example, enabled military reforms. Louis XI's triumph over the League solidified his diplomatic dominance, and Anne de Beaujeu's victory in the Mad War integrated Brittany into France, well, increasing the public domain, de facto, or even when indirectly. These outcomes accelerated centralization, reducing noble autonomy. Right, the noblemen, as you know, did not disappear, but they were increasingly more irregimented with their troops into the royal armies. The Crown's need to counter rebellions drove innovations as well. Charles VII reorganized revenues into regional généralités, and Louis XI expanded royal supervision over towns and clergy. These changes, while provoking noble backlash, increased the Crown's wealth and administrative efficiency, proving that they were that effective to unnerve the opponents. Rebels sought access to Crown wealth such as pensions, fiefs, or tax exemptions. Temporary concessions, as we've seen in Normandy in 1465, drained royal resources, but the Crown's ability to reclaim these, for example, Louis XI's own recovery of Normandy eventually ensured long-term fiscal control. These were, after all, still fiefs of the Crown, so they weren't really something sort of more escaping from control, like Burgundy, for example. Like, there was always a degree of that, as well as connection, by the way, but at large, they're very different things in practice. So one could also talk of a critical evaluation of the sources, right? There is no doubt that let's say, for example, the role of magnates, the reformist pretext, the focus on influence over revolution are all confirmed. From one side, there is also the final royal victory, which the sources may thus sort of overly emphasize, reflecting a top-down perspective. Lesser nobles' motivations, often overshadowed by magnates, also deserve more scrutiny, as their participation was crucial to rebellion scale. Additionally, the sources focus on male leaders, such as Charles the Bold overlooks figures like Anne de Beaujeu, whose regency was very crucial in 1488. So there are sort of different ideas that can be thrown into the meat grinder of history. And surely this is a period that we haven't really covered too much. Like, I haven't arrived to the point of, it would be insane, but we can do it, of creating, that I have basically playlists for every century, right? And some of these have literally hundreds of videos already, and I could make even just, 15th century France as a playlist on its own, like all the various centuries, and maybe one day we will get there, but there's going to be enough videos, as a matter of fact. However, this is really one field we have to expand more in, right? If you look at, for example, my 15th century playlist, has only 87 videos. I mean, it's a lot, yes, but it talks also about lots of other things, right? All the 15th century, of course, it's mostly about Europe, but at large, it feels like we haven't even began to talk about the whole thing. It's good, it feels good that we have all this stuff. Here we have the beautiful video about Louis XI that people keep watching, interestingly enough, because he's a very interesting sovereign, for sure. I more recently made something about Charles VII, also the Burgundian states. Where's Charles VII. I may have not inserted it. Oh no, here it is, friend. Yeah, this was watched less. But, yeah, this really depends in many ways. In general, we can say that there is a pretty consistent amount of videos, but we have to really get a bit more into depths of it. It's as if we started covering enough, everything, but mostly just as overviews. And unfortunately, the evidential videos, this video, for example, is also a more general view, but it's sort of an interesting addition, because whenever we're going to talk, if we have already discussed it, again, Charles VII, Louis XI in particular, so this adds up to the context, so it perfectly blends in. Also, the videos about the single, historical French regions and so on. So it's by this process of gradual stratification that we really get somewhere. Comparatively, for example, medieval France. Let's check the medieval France playlist that I updated yesterday, so it's already here. This would be the 105th video about France. I'm glad we surpassed the 100th. I'm planning to actually, it's difficult because I haven't included in this the Carolingian, like all the sort of pre-French, properly pre-nationally French history, so to say. So we start from Hugh Capet, or at least no, we start from the Carolingian partitions, rather. So there is France there as well already, but for the playlist. But also here, we made a lot about France, but a few evidential history. We have mostly to invest in that, and gradually we're going to cover everything. Because again, what doesn't happen immediately now is something which is going to happen later, right? That's the actual trick to this all. I'm just glad and thankful that I could discuss the stuff in the first place. French history, by the way, is very complex. Like, as I always said, ever since I started Schwerpunkt, I've never really found like too many, like there are, of course, but let's say we'll have to explore this further, like some more unitarily comprehensive histories of France to tell a bit more in depth the history of the country. Like, and the same goes for Germany, as a matter of fact, for England in part, because we didn't talk about England as much as we would like. But again, we have to cover so many other countries at the same time, so it becomes all, for those, it's even less. As a matter of fact, these are very important national markers, so you really must, as much as you can. And I'm glad to see that at the end of the day, step by step, we're getting there, and we can definitely do more. There's also more exotic stuff sometimes interspersed, but we also at some point come back on our footstep. There is history of literature, of chivalry. In the meanwhile, it's all baked in. You see how many different videos you can make at the end of the day, just about the broader picture. Yeah, this is basically it, and and see lots of interesting stuff incoming. And yes, it's this stratifying process more than else, more than else. Very well. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.